similar to a black-green Constellation deck.
Much closer to that than a Whip of Erebos strategy. But, again, splitting the difference between the two.
Absolutely. Well, we're underway. Braun-Duin winning the role. He'll be on the play and start on Sandstep Citadel. Both, as we have a lot of green decks in the top 4 here, you'd expect the first few turns to see a lot of tap lands in our games.
Though Brian, again, more aggressive than the other decks that you see in the semifinals, with both Fleecemane Lion and Rakshasa Death Dealer as 2-drops. Both of these 2-drops very powerful against Sylvan Caryatid. Usually very good at blocking early drops, but not effective against blocking any of Brian's 2s.
Yeah, and it's exactly the card you mentioned right there. Fleecemane Lion, the 2-drop for Brian. He'll have it on the board. Gerard with the 2-drop of his own. It's Sylvan Caryatid, but as you said, Caryatid, while traditionally good against aggressive 2-drops, not good against either of the ones in Brian's deck. Fleecemane Lion will swing in for 3.
The whole threat base here is informed by trying to beat these green decks. You have 2-drops that can attack through Caryatid. You have Anafenza, which breaks up Whip of Erebos strategies. You have Wingmate Rock, and these decks are often soft in the air. They don't have a lot of blockers besides Hornet Queen. Multiple main deck copies, in fact, 4 of BioBlight also to help out with Hornet Queen. So Brian really prepared for these green decks.
Yeah, and this curve from Brian, we've seen this before. It is the most efficient a deck can be. The 3-3 for 2 into a 4-4 for 3, which is Anafenza the foremost. It's so much power, so fast, and we've seen him steamroll players with this sort of draw.
These Sultai-Reanimator decks and the Obzan ones as well can be a little bit fidgety. You know, it takes them a while to get on the board. It takes them a while to get anything of substance going. And if you just go 3-3 into 4-4 while breaking up their graveyard, it can be a hard draw to answer.
Well, it will overload Gerard's removal, but he does have at least one spell, plays a third land into play tapped, and thanks to Sylvan Caryatid, is able to Hero's Downfall the Anafenza. He'll go down to 14 on the attack, but only have 2 creatures in play for Brian.
And all these gold creatures that Brian brings to the table also makes Sultai Charm problematic.
Yeah, Sultai Charm only destroying mono-colored creatures. You see here Gerard going for Eidolon of Blossoms on this next turn. He is just down on size, whereas Brian's playing 3-3s for 2, Gerard's playing 2-2s for 4.
The Sultai-Reanimator's got a lot of power in it. It's definitely the more powerful deck of the 2, but you get a feeling Gerard's on pace this game to lose with a lot of spells left over in his hand. He just does not have that much time to deploy everything.
Well, here comes a swing in for 5 from Brian. It's the Rakshasa Death Dealer and Fleecemane Lion. Eidolon of Blossoms would have to chump unless Gerard wants to take the full amount of damage. It could be at least 5, as much as 7, depending on how much Brian wants to put into this Death Dealer.
Now, what's attractive about chump blocking here is that if Gerard puts it in front of the Death Dealer, it at least requires 2 mana out of Brian.
And as you see, 2 mana, actually too steep of a price there. Brian will deal the 3 damage, and he'll actually trade away with the Eidolon of Blossoms, opting instead for a copy of Siege Rhino, the marquee 4-drop of the format.
If Brian's willing to make this exchange, I think it means his hand's got to be loaded with a lot of power, and he doesn't intend on pumping into the Death Dealer much at all over the course of this game. So bad news for Gerard. I don't think that BBD makes that attack and fails to pump unless his hand is loaded with powerful, expensive cards.
Well, the 4-5 Trampler is pretty good, and I believe Brian has the perfect follow-up for Siege Rhino, and that's going to be another Siege Rhino. You see Gerard going for another Eidolon here, but his creature is just so much smaller. Already down to 8, he's going to take a lot of damage here, and maybe a lethal amount of it.
And Gerard can't really complain about his draw. Totally solid opening here. Caryatid into removal spell into 2 copies of Eidolon of the Blossoms. You know, not a shabby start by any means, but Brian just doing what his deck does, jumping on top of these green decks before they can get much of a board established.
Well, Gerard's deck, when you see a card like Eidolon of Blossoms, you can see in its text here, drawing a card from itself and any other enchantment, just how much potential there is with this card. In an enchantment-based strategy, this can pull away from a game, but there is a little bit of a drawback. If you want this kind of ability, you have to sacrifice efficiency, and Brian is just capitalizing on that. His cards are too big for Gerard to mess around with this kind of card draw.
The Sultai-Reanimator deck definitely has a lot of game against other green decks that are trying to go long. It's got a lot of powerful graveyard interactions, but BBD is just not letting him play that kind of game.
Swing from Brian puts Gerard down to 1, and another Siege Rhino will do the trick. Game 1 goes for Brian Braun-Duin.
A 4-minute affair. And keep in mind, players have a habit of slowing down here when the pressure rises and the rounds become untimed and there's a lot of money at stake, and we still got through game 1 in 4 minutes.
All right, well, game 1, I think Gerard knew it would be bad. He and Reed's deck set up to beat a different kind of deck, but when we go to the sideboard, things get a lot closer, and that's where it will matter in this best of 5.
So Gerard has Treasure Cruise, Thoughtseize, 2 copies of Read the Bones, a Kior the Crashing Waves, 2 copies of Ashiok, a Sultai Charm, a Silence the Believers, 2 copies of Negate, a Hero's Downfall, 2 Disdainful Strokes, and 1 BioBlight. The most important thing for Gerard here is to get some more creature removal into his deck. As you saw there, he just got run out before he could do much with his hand. So that Bile-Blight, the Hero's Downfall, especially the copy of Silence the Believers. I think because so much of Brian's threat base is gold, Sultai Charm is a little dubious. Past that, you start looking at some of the Planeswalkers. Kiora can do some amount of work if it's being supplemented by other removal spells that Gerard's bringing in. I expect the one Kiora to come in. The 2 copies of Ashiok, I don't think it's really an Ashiok matchup, but Gerard brings this card in against just a wide spectrum of opponents. And I think a green deck with enough creatures where Ashiok is regularly going to be revealing things that Gerard can put into play, he might bring it in, even though it's probably more for mid-range matchups.
Yeah, so you're saying removal. We looked at game 1. Gerard had the Hero's Downfall, at least for Brian's Anafenza. That was pretty good, but it seemed like Gerard needed 2 more Hero's Downfalls in the situation if he wanted to survive.
What's important for Gerard in this matchup is to get into a position where he's casting 2 spells a turn. We saw there that he was only casting 1 spell a turn, and when Brian's on the front foot and attacking for so much, and Gerard's creatures are relatively small, that's not a winning recipe.
Right.
So if he loads up with 2 and 3 mana removal spells, he can get to a stage where he's playing Eidolon of Blossoms and Bile-Blighting a threat, casting a Courser of Crewfix and Hero's Downfall in the same turn. Those are the kinds of exchanges he needs to be able to leverage his more powerful cards.
Yeah, in game 1, he was able to remove Brian's creatures to a point, but every time he was taking 3 off Fleecemane Lion, because when he was spending his whole turn killing Brian's newest threat, he never had time to deal with the 3/3.
Exactly. Gerard died with 4 or 5 spells in his hand. He just did not have enough time to deploy it. With some more removal in his sideboard, especially the cheap stuff, he might be able to get there.
Now, before we go over to Brian's deck, I do have one question about Gerard's sideboard. And Gerard and Reed Duke are playing nearly the same deck, but Gerard spiced up the sideboard in a way that you would really expect out of Gerard Fabiano, putting copies of Ashiok Nightmare Weaver in his sideboard. Traditionally a deck that's good against big green creatures. Is this a matchup for him?
If I was in Gerard's seat, I would not bring it in. I think that he's absolutely the control deck in the matchup, that if he's able to create a stable board, he's going to be in a favorable position anyway. Ashiok's really only good in that sort of situation to begin with. Gerard really likes the card, though, and especially on the play, I think it becomes a more attractive option. I could see Gerard saying, when I'm on the play, I want Ashiok. When I'm on the draw, I don't. I could see him bringing it in no matter what. I could see him leaving in the sideboard no matter what. I think any one of those paths is justifiable. I think I would just tend on not bringing it in, but Gerard likes the card a lot more than I do, probably more than just about anyone in the Players' Championship does. It wouldn't surprise me if they got brought in, regardless of player draw.
Well, on Brian's sideboard, he's kept it to a smaller number of cards, but more high-impact options. 3 copies of Back to Nature, 1 Murderous Cut, 2 Nissa Worldwaker, and 2 Sorin Solemn Visitor seems like the cards he needs to consider for this matchup.
The 3 Back to Natures are great here. They can either be good 1-for-1 removal spells or be sweepers if Gerard develops his board a certain way, and the Planeswalkers can give him some more resistance if the game goes long.
So Planeswalkers still generally seem pretty good here because of their difficulty to remove?
Yes, I think Nissa is low impact, though, because Gerard is Sultai, he doesn't have the same density of large creatures that the Abzan variants have. And I think that he just wants more resistance, anticipating the game going longer, because Gerard's going to have more removal.
All right, we're underway with game 2. This time Gerard's on the play. Once again, he has a 2-drop. It's going to be his copy of Sylvan Caryatid, and Brian, matching pace for pace, hits Fleecemane Lion again for him. Similar start, but this time the play draw is reversed.
I'm curious how much of the cheap stuff Brian left in his deck amongst his threat base, because it becomes a lot worse when he's on the draw. Gerard can get to things like Courser of Crewfix.
Or how about Ashiok Nightmare Weaver? We wondered if he'd bring it in. Answer is, of course, this is Gerard Fabiano afterward. It pluses up to 5 loyalty, exiling a full 3 creatures. That's Anafenza, Fleecemane Lion, and Wingmate Rock.
Surprise, surprise, but not really.
You know, this card, I've seen it do a number. I've had, when this card can manage to steal something like Pelucranos, it can be a pain for a green deck to get through.
It has its moments, and if Brian was playing the mid-range variant, I think there's no question Ashiok would come in. I'm a little more skeptical of it here because Brian is attacking early and often.
Yeah, and once again, Brian has a great curve. It's the 3/3 into a 4/4. Fleecemane Lion into Anafenza. And you're right, Gerard took that turn to cast Ashiok rather than something like a Hero's Downfall. And despite the fact that he's on the play, he feels behind again.
Well, he does have the option of just cashing in this Ashiok for a Fleecemane Lion. So not the end of the world because he flipped over one of Brian's 2s.
Yeah, and that's what it's going to be. Ashiok, last 2 loyalty go away. Fleecemane Lion into play for Gerard. 4th land, 5th land. He's going to go ahead and actually just use the Monstrosity ability on it. Gerard not playing a white deck, but thanks to Fleecemane Lion's, or rather, thanks to Sylvan Caryatid's ability to make any color, he can Monstrosity the Fleecemane Lion. So now he has a 4/4 indestructible hexproof.
And now very hard for Brian to attack.
Yeah, I'm not sure that. I mean, Abzan can't remove this creature from the board. It'll be here for the rest of the game.
His one way to get out from under this is a Sorin emblem, but we are a ways away from that.
Yeah, well, Brian will do Thoughtseize. This is actually in his main deck.
4 copies in the main.
You see Hornet Queen, Eidolon of Blossoms, and 2 more land from Gerard. This is a great Thoughtseize for Brian.
Not a lot going on in Gerard's hand, and Brian does have some ways to answer the Hornet Queen. He does have copies of Bioblight and additional Thoughtseize can get it out before Gerard has a chance to cast it.
Yeah, as soon as next turn, that would have been a Hornet Queen. So this was the last chance that Brian wanted to snag it this way. And take Hornet Queen he will. That leaves Gerard with lands and Eidolon of Blossoms. But once again, that a 4/4 Indestructible is going to be very good here. Brian may have to make his creatures bigger or take to the skies, you'd think.
Yeah, he does have 4 copies of Wingmate Rock in his main deck. We know one's already been exiled because of Ashiok, but that would be a good place to start.
And here is the Eidolon of Blossoms we know about from Fabiano. He will draw, has 2 lands in hand, 2 other cards. Here's one of the lands, it's Opulent Palace. Gerard, no way to deal damage. He's not under threat thanks to that indestructible creature, but he will just pass back to Brian.
What a bizarre opening for Gerard here, but certainly powerful.
Yeah, both players trading lands back and forth. And I would think that would favor the Reanimator deck. If he can keep this Eidolon of Blossoms in play, he can start to get that enchantment engine going.
Definitely. Though the fact that Brian didn't strip it out of his hand last time, I think, implies that there's likely to be a removal spell for it.
And we'll go Courser of Krufix. This will put it to the test. Can he remove it? If not, Gerard, the Eidolon of Blossom plus Courser of Krufix, that's a great engine for any sort of Sultai deck.
Keep in mind, Brian does have 3 copies of Back to Nature in his sideboard. So maybe he has no answer to the Eidolon. Maybe he's allowing Gerard to build up a bit of a board.
All right, Gerard nets 1 free card off Courser. That's a forest he gets off the top. The next card on top is a copy of Murderous Cut. And speaking of enchantments, here's a good one that Gerard got in the meantime. It's Whip of Erebos.
And I don't think he minds overextending this into Back to Nature because the Whip of Erebos isn't really doing anything right now anyway, because Gerard's not in a great position to attack, and his graveyard is turned off because of the Inoffensive.
Yeah, now, if Gerard is getting free cards off all of these enchantments, which he is doing, yes, he's playing into Back to Nature, but it seems like he's not actually paying that much of a price for it. Like, they're all free cards.
It's a classic hedge, you know? If Brian has it, it's not the end of the world, and if he doesn't have it, you're doing great.
Well, Brian did. So Back to Nature, that destroys all enchantments. So Courser of Krufix, Eidolon of Blossoms, and Whip of Erebos all hit the graveyard. Gerard flips his top card over, but we know it to be a land.
And Brian with Wingmate Rock in hand. Is he willing to cash in this Inoffensive? Because that is likely to be the cost to get a rated Wingmate Rock into play.
Yeah, now if he thinks he has a turn to spare, he could make his own Fleecemane line indestructible and use that to trigger raid next turn. But it is a pretty big cost. It costs him a whole turn to do that.
It's a slow burn, but I think he knows enough about Gerard's hand and the fact that there's a Murderous Cut on top of the deck anyway that it's worth protecting and just going for it next turn.
Yeah, Murderous Cut in Gerard's hand even, land on top. That's land 7 for Gerard. He is low on cards. We know that it's Murderous Cut that he has left. 1 other card. Brian doesn't know about that one. Suspects it might be a land. And this Fleecemane line has done a great job of protecting Gerard. He's still at 21, was never really under threat by his life total, but Brian may just be able to overpower him right now.
It seems likely, in fact. I mean, it's going to be hard for Gerard to answer this Hornet Queen without, or excuse me, this Wingmate Rock without either Hornet Queen or multiple removal spells.
Fleecemane Lion will swing into Fleecemane Lion. They'll bounce off each other in an indestructible fight, but it was never the intention to deal damage. He was attacking so that Wingmate Rock would get another 3/4 with it, and that's what will happen. 6 power in the air for Brian, and this is something that Fleecemane Lion cannot jump in front of.
As you mentioned before, most likely Brian having to take to the skies to be able to get through Gerard's ground defenses.
Yeah, that'll get the Murderous Cut out of Gerard's hand. It's the one we knew about. Fleecemane Lion is down. Gerard continues to make land drops. And maybe now Brian will finally get that chance to get some damage in.
Before the top 4 started, Reed Duke was looking over all the deck lists of the potential competitors in the semifinals. He looked at Gerard, was staring at Brian's deck list, and said, "This guy's got a lot for us." You're seeing it on display.
And the Back to Nature out of the sideboard, really the cincher. The main deck for Brian's pretty good already. As he finally gets some damage in, Gerard is down to 18 from the 3/4 token. giving Brian another Fleece main line. If he makes both of them indestructible, he can start crashing them both into Gerard. Neither deck with a very good answer to a Fleece main line once it becomes indestructible.
Yeah, you have to work around it to some extent or get to a Sorin Emblem.
Yeah, a Sorin Emblem, which is a long ways off. The game seems like it becomes about things like flyers at that point. Hornet Queen from Gerard, Wingmate Rock from Brian.
It's about trumps. It's no longer about, do you have a slight edge on the ground?
Ton of mana from Gerard. That's going to be Silence the Believers Strived twice. So if you aren't familiar with that card, normally you don't get to see it cast for 10, but it's a pretty good one when it is.
And I was about to mention how Gerard's flooding out a little bit, but this is a nice payoff.
Yeah, so he gets to exile any number of creatures, and that number is going to be 3 here, taking care of everything but the Hexproof Fleece main line, and a great reset from Fabiano.
Things were falling apart for him, but now he's playing draw step to draw step, and his deck's probably a little bit more powerful overall.
Reset, both players playing off the top. Who can draw out of it first? I think you're right. This is a spot that Gerard wanted to get himself into. When he has cards like Farika, God of Affliction, Whip of Erebos, Eidolon of Blossoms, these are the things that should be able to pull him ahead on a stalled board.
Brian most likely sitting on a hand of land or removal spells, which gives Gerard a lot of time to top deck value creatures.
Even something like Ashiok Nightmare Weaver would be very good for Gerard right here.
Ashiok would be perfect right now.
Both players trading draws, neither person really wanting to try to get ahead at the moment. Both decks are full of answers, not sure how many threats either of them have. We'll get to see what Brian's on. It's a Thoughtseize from Gerard, and it's Murder's Cut, Bioblade, Hero's Downfall, all kill spells.
Not surprising that Brian's just sitting on a hand of removal spells. He would have deployed threats if he had them.
Seems like the choice would be between Bioblade and Hero's Downfall. Downfall takes care of something like Ashiok, whereas Blight's a great answer against Hornet Queen. Gerard doesn't seem to have either in his hand, so he's gonna play the odds and pick one of the two.
And I think I would prefer going after the Bioblight there because Hornet Queen seems like the higher upside draw of the two, but it is kind of half a dozen of one, 6 of the other, you know?
Well, Brian's the first one to draw Trump, swings in with Fleece main line, and it is his second copy of Wingmate Rock. Can Gerard draw back? We will see.
Well, one of the biggest drawbacks that he has at this point is a Hornet Queen, which is not really a drawback because of the Bioblight.
Yeah, he would get rid of one of the bird tokens. One of the 2 birds, but not both. Bioblight taking care of all of the 1/1 insects, leaving just the queen.
And BBD still with the Murderer's Cut left over as well, so he can clean up the whole thing.
Right, swing for 6 in the air, drops Gerard down to 10. He has 2 turns left to find some sort of answer. One thing you can say about Wingmate Rock is it is efficient. It kills quickly.
And the Sultai Reanimator deck, a little soft in the air.
Yeah, puts a lot of pressure on its Hornet Queens to stabilize there. See a Satyr Wayfinder from Gerard. Remember, now that the Anafenza is no longer in play, Gerard actually can put creatures into the graveyard. They will not get exiled.
And it looks like Gerard has brought in the Treasure Cruise, anticipating a longer game.
Repairing a broken sleeve here. Satyr Wayfinder did not find land, just milled for 4. And that was the draw for Gerard. He'll pass back to Brian. He's going to need a great draw next turn.
I don't even know if there really is a draw at this juncture because we know that Brian has an answer to the Hornet Queen, and Gerard has already cast his 1 copy of Silence the Believers.
Yeah, that definitely is his best one there. Yeah, I think you're right. This is going to be difficult for him to come out of. Maybe if he has a Hornet Queen, he can survive for a turn, or he could draw something like Whip of Erebos. Then he could gain life and stabilize for a bit. If he draws Whip this following turn, he can gain some life with his Fleece main line, and then the next turn, if he found a Hornet Queen, then he might be in an okay spot.
He may have some running draws to crawl back into it, but
you're right, it's not good. He's down to 4, and on his last draw, is it a winner? And no, it is not. So 2-0, Brian gets up a second game, and Gerard is going to have to run through the rest of the set if he wants to make it into the finals.
which means being on the draw twice, assuming that he's able to win game number 3, it's going to be a big challenge.
Absolutely. So both players going back shuffling here. And each game, Brian has started with Fleece main line into Anafenza. How important is it for him to get out with that kind of speed?
Definitely on the draw, it's important. On the play, he's going to kind of get on the front foot if he has any sort of reasonable draw. Of course, he would like to have that kind of opening, but a little less important on the play. On the draw, really important for him to keep up the pressure because things got a little harrowing there in the mid game. You saw once we were playing top of deck to top of deck, we felt like Gerard had a pretty good shot. Brian drew a wingmate rock first, and Gerard didn't find anything of substance, so Brian went on to win the game. But it's important for Brian to capitalize on his early advantages because as you start shifting later and later in the game, you feel like Gerard's got a better shot.
And that's one of the really difficult parts you see here is that it's clear that Brian's better in the early game. He's playing a lot of creatures to do that, but that game was different. That wasn't the early game that Brian won in. Gerard did what he needed to do. He got a wall up, he stabilized, he removed all of Brian's cards, left Brian with just some kill spells in hand, and then Gerard lost from that spot. And I think if you're a Fabiano fan, that's got to be concerning.
It does. Part of the problem is that one of the trumps that these mid-range decks, these Reanimator decks, typically have against the beatdown decks is Whip of Erebos. The lifelink is relevant, and then you start grinding value out of your graveyard, you get back these Hornet Queens, it's all sorts of problems. Because of Anafenza, because of Back to Nature, I don't even know if Whip of Erebos is a palatable card. I thought it's potentially something Gerard would remove from his deck altogether.
Yeah.
And then once you get past Whip of Erebos, you're looking at cards like Hornet Queen as his trumps, but we know there's BioBlight in BBD sideboard as well. So it's not clear that even if Gerard gets out of the early game, he has that much of an advantage because Brian has some good answers to the trumps that Gerard would traditionally go to in this kind of matchup.
Yeah, 3 copies of Back to Nature in Brian's board, and Gerard's not the kind of deck to win quickly. So it means if this game goes to the turn 8, turn 9 that you often see it going, it's not unreasonable to think that Brian will have a Back to Nature nearly every game.
And it's, part of the splash damage for the construction of this deck. They've gotten away a little bit from the Reanimator shell. There's no copies of Sidisi, for example, and they've shifted to this Constellation build. Even under normal circumstances, just having Back to Nature for Corsair or Krufix and Whip of Erebos would already be a valid sideboard slot. BBD would be bringing in that card anyway. The fact that Eidolon of Blossoms, Doomwake Giant, and potentially some other cards get swept up in it as well, that's even better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, those players are going to resume the match shortly here, getting ready for Game 3. Could be up to a 5-game match. You're watching right now, this is the 2014 Players' Championship. We've been building up all year through our Open Series and Invitationals. The top 16 players from 2014 coming here to compete. We are down to our last 4, among them Gerard Fabiano and Brian Braun-Duin.
After this, we're going to have Brad Nelson versus Reed Duke in what I anticipate being a much longer matchup than what we've seen here thus far.
Yeah, both players opting for Whip of Erebos. That one could be quite the battle.
And Gerard, still always a lot of positive energy. Down 2-0 in a tough matchup, but still smiling, giving the thumbs up. He knows he's up against it, but not dead just yet.
Well, as we get closer toward the end of the year, we also get closer toward the holidays. And if you've been following Star City Games, we do have a holiday sale going on. It's been starting at the beginning of the month. New items introduced every day on our website, Monday through Friday. So 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Check it out. This is StarCityGames.com. On the main page, our holiday sale.
A lot of good deals. It gets updated periodically, running through the end of the month.
Well, Gerard, this is Game 3. He's back on the play as he was before. We're going to see what he had. Brian's going to start with a Thoughtseize. And this is the tough part. Even though Gerard's the control deck, there's these weapons like Thoughtseize that Brian can use to pick Gerard's hand apart. You see here, Gerard's kept nothing bad. He has Disdainful Stroke, Corsair of Krufix, Read the Bones, Kiora the Crashing Wave, and 2 more lands.
But there's kind of some moving parts in this hand. There's the one creature that, if Brian's got one removal spell in his hand, it lines up very nicely. There's Read the Bones when he's going to be on the back foot. Disdainful Stroke, no guarantee that that's going to be good. Kiora the Crashing Wave, Brian may be able to build up a board and attack through it. So even though this is a solid opening hand from Gerard, there's a lot of things that can easily go wrong here.
Well, if you take Corsair of Krufix out of this hand, the one thing you can say, this hand is not actually good at dealing with creatures. Gerard's Disdainful Stroke can't be played early. The Read the Bones, a lot of his cards don't affect the board very well.
Yeah, based on Brian's hand, there's multiple paths of attack there. I think any one of those cards in Gerard's hand is potentially the one to take, but Brian gets the information and gets to make the best decision.
Yeah, he takes the Kiora, and we'll see what he has. Is it a turn 2 Fleece main line? It is for the 3rd game in a row. Gerard, without a clean answer to this, he'll have Corsair of Krufix, but you have to think, if Brian left this card in his hand when he had a Fleece main line opening, I'm worried if I'm Gerard.
Probably not a good chance that it's resolving, and then you might be looking at a 4-turn of either deciding to leave up Disdainful Stroke or casting Read the Bones. Neither a good spot to be in when you're facing down a Fleece main lion.
Well, I'm thinking here, if Brian attacks, you'd have to wonder whether or not he has an Obzon charm to take care of the courser in the event that Gerard blocks.
Oh, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong here.
Swing from Brian. 3 pain lands on Brian's side, by the way. He has gone down to 15 already this game.
That was a very fast block from Gerard.
Well, does he have the luxury that he, maybe he knows that there's a trick coming, and it is with Obzon charm, but does he have the luxury of just taking damage here?
I don't think so.
Me neither. So Brian takes down the blocker, and Fleecemane Lion's now a 5/5. You see Braun-Duin's down to 12 with that spell, though.
Here's the thing, even, it's one of those attacks where Gerard has to block a good percentage of the time just because it's free for Brian to do it. It costs him nothing. So if he's regularly saying no blocks there, over time he's giving up a lot of damage.
I mean, the courser might as well not be there if he's never going to block with it.
Yeah.
And for Gerard, he passes back, and look at how Brian sculpted this. He takes Kiora the Crashing Wave, knowing that if he Obzon Charms into that courser, what would be the best card for Gerard to have right here? Kiora would be pretty good.
Yes. And that's the problem with Gerard's hand. Very good on the surface, but problematic because of the Thoughtseize.
And Brian, a little bit of a misstep with his deck, though, doesn't hit the 4th land. Gerard murders cutting the Fleecemane Lion on end step, and now he'll go for Eidolon of Blossoms, and Gerard may just be able to stabilize here.
That was a good opening there. Gerard kept up Disdainful Stroke and said, in case Brian had something like Siege Rhino, and because nothing happened, he was able to use Murderous Cut to take care of the Fleecemane Lion. A good turn for Gerard.
Bioblight takes care of Eidolon of Blossoms, but on Brian's side, things just continue to be painful. He's down to 10 from his own lands. Basically has his own personal mana barbs in play.
The Urborg is a start. It means he at least has pain-free access to black now.
Plays Siege Rhino. Brian will gain 1. Gerard takes 3. Gerard down to 12. Well, Brian technically gains 3, but took 2 to cast it. And down to 12, Gerard's going to have to cast Read the Bones. And even against a start that was fraught with peril for Brian, tons of damage on his own side, missing a land, Gerard down to 12 it's dicey already.
Absolutely. If he doesn't have a removal spell for the Siege Rhino, it's all sorts of trouble. And Gerard's still with the Disdainful Stroke stranded in his hand that Brian knows about. So Brian gets a lot of workarounds here.
Right, and that seems to me the key of that Thoughtseize. Brian not taking a card like Disdainful Stroke because he never really has to. He puts enough pressure on Gerard that Gerard has to tap out for things like Read the Bones, Eidolon of Blossoms, Kiora, and that Gerard can't just for free leave up this Disdainful Stroke. So when he does, Brian doesn't have to play into it.
Yeah, Brian has a lot of different routes to take the game. And Gerard can't really play that inefficiently with his mana because he's under the gun the whole time. Every time he passes with 2 mana up, it's a huge disaster.
Well, he plays Read the Bones. No removal spell for the Rhino. Brian will put Gerard down to 6 on the attack. And no plays, doesn't want to get Disdainful Stroked. He'll just pass. And we untap for Gerard. He's going to have to make a move here.
Brian would Siege Rhino in hand, but of course does not want to run that into a Disdainful Stroke. So if Gerard's not going to do anything, Brian's happy to just attack for 4.
Gerard, land number 7, he passes. Looks like Anafenza the draw for Brian.
Anafenza is a great draw here for Brian, as it's something that he can cast without getting hit with a Disdainful Stroke.
Well, Siege Rhino will try for it. Gerard will go ahead and Hero's Downfall it. Does not take damage thanks to the Urborg on Brian's side of the board. Follow-up play. Does not want to get Disdainful Stroked. It will be the Anafenza from Brian.
And Anafenza is not a bad consolation prize, even though he's trying to play under the Disdainful Stroke. Still a 4-power threat.
Yep. At 6 and 9 life, the game is close right now. Brian has been stuck on lands, just 4. 7 on Gerard's side of the table. However, both players with about the same number of cards in hand. So while you normally feel like the control deck, Gerard, is stabilizing here, it's not clear he's even ahead on their hands.
Well, things get really good for Gerard if he has a removal spell for Anafenza, because he has Disdainful Stroke to counter Brian's next big play, whether it's Wingmate Rock, Siege Rhino, what have you. Brian is taking a lot of damage off of his lands, and if Gerard can prevent Brian from resolving something big, it doesn't take that much out of Gerard to turn around and win the game.
No, you're absolutely right. And what I really like about Disdainful Stroke here is Brian only has 4 lands. So if Gerard gets to use that Disdainful Stroke, it's not just going to get Brian's card, but it'll get Brian's turn on top of it.
Exactly, and that's why Brian is jumping through some hoops here to prevent that from happening.
All right, Silence the Believers on the Anafenza on end step. Gerard untaps 7 lands in play. It's going to be Hornet Queen, the draw for the turn. Couldn't have asked for something much better.
Perfect. And again, look at Brian's life total.
It certainly could be higher. Last turn he had to pain again to go ahead and make the Anafenza, went down to 9. Brian will get a window to resolve Siege Rhino. That'll put Gerard to 3, but tough road. On end step, Brian's going to murderously cut the Hornet Queen, leaving just some insects. And maybe, is it possible that Brian has the Bioblight?
Well, he definitely wants to get the 4-cost card out of his hand in the first order of business. He's not going to get another shot to this game.
Yep. So cuts the Hornet Queen. Siege Rhino into play. Gerard is down to 3. Brian is at 12.
Keep in mind the Siege Rhino has trample, so it's really problematic to try to leave tokens back to block.
Yeah. Gerard needs to leave back a lot of toughness. He cannot take 3 here. And he really can't take down Disdainful Stroke anymore either.
If Gerard can find a removal spell, he's in really good shape.
4 Hornets swing in. Brian will go down to 6. Does Gerard have the kill spell? He does. Hero's Downfall. Gets to leave up Disdainful Stroke. This seems great for Gerard.
Brian can still get to Bioblight here and at least be in no sudden risk of dying. But if he doesn't have that, he's going to fall to 2 here. The pain lands are really starting to add up.
And Brian down to 2 off those Hornets. And it will be Courser of Krufix from Gerard, being sure to leave up Disdainful Stroke. He plays a Temple that puts him to 4, shows Sylvan Caryatid on the top. Gerard will scry that one away. Next card waiting, Yavimaya Coast. And we go to Brian. He passes back, simply draws a card, and it might be game 2 for Gerard. Here's the swing, and there you have it. Gerard, not out just yet, starts the comeback. 1 game down. That was one on the play. 2 more to go.
Yeah, Brian passing the turn there just to get a little bit more information off of the Courser reveal, but you saw Gerard's game plan there. If he can break serve, if he can keep the board stable and hold up the Disdainful Stroke, then he can start really leveraging the power of his deck. Because if he starts making land drops and gets to make a play with Disdainful Stroke mana still available, it's hard for Brian to play back. He just doesn't have the same level of power once the big spells in his hand are cut off.
Well, if I were to describe that game, it seemed like a lot of 1-for-1s. And you said earlier, it's not that the Sultai Reanimator deck has tons of card advantage, because it really doesn't. What it is that once they get to the point where they can play 2 spells in 1 turn to Brian's 1, that's when Gerard would pull ahead. And that's really what we saw. He kept pace, until eventually Gerard played a kill spell and a threat.
And Disdainful Stroke, even though it never even got cast, represents the 2 spells in 1 turn, because all of Brian's lines of play that could have allowed him catch up, well, they were shut off by the Disdainful Stroke.
Yeah. Now, no real surprises out of the sideboard so far. One thing I do want to talk about is that this is the first post-board game we've had with Brian on the play. If you're Brian, Braun-Duin, or I guess even Gerard, do you change how that makes you look at the game?
I think that it definitely changes Ashiok. We saw it when Gerard was on the play in game 2. I think it's got to get out of the deck on the draw. Past that, I don't know if a lot changes. Read the Bones, and to a lesser degree, Treasure Cruise become less palatable for me if I'm in Gerard's seat. But I think Brian keeps more or less the same deck intact.
Yeah, you're not sure if Gerard has time to play things like Ashiok and Read the Bones.
Exactly. Now, again, it's light sideboarding, but I think that there is some, play-draw arguments for the cards that are in Gerard's deck and sideboard. I think that's less the case with BBD.
Now, when you look at things like Read the Bones, I agree that I think they're pretty slow on the draw for Gerard. It seems like there might be a critical mass of those, though, that he needs to have here. I mean, those are his sources of card advantage. Can Gerard just play a 1-for-1 game and hope it to work out well?
Probably not. And what I like about that game plan that we just saw game 3 out of Gerard did not involve Whip of Erebos at all. And I think that's a really important part of Gerard winning this matchup is I think getting much value out of the graveyard is going to be a long shot. Brian has a lot of ways to get Whip of Erebos off the table. He also has a lot of ways to muck up Gerard using the graveyard as a resource. And I think Gerard's much better served trying to play a traditional mid-range game where the mid-range deck is typically favored against the aggro deck rather than trying to maximize his graveyard synergies, which I think plays into Brian's hands.
Yeah. To me, the most problematic cards for Gerard in this matchup are the Siege Rhinos from Brian. Well, outside of Anafenza, are the Siege Rhinos and the Wingmate Rock in particular. We've seen when Brian was able to make 6 power in the air, it cost Gerard almost always at least 2 cards to take care of it.
It's tough. Now, post-board he gets Disdainful Stroke, and that's a great answer to all the cards you just mentioned. But in the absence of his counterspells, and there really aren't that many, Siege Rhino and Wingmate Rock both represent big problems.
Well, we have Brian on the play for game 4. Starts on a tap land, Sandstep Citadel. Gerard with a Temple of his own. And for the first game, Brian does not have a 2-drop. No Fleece Mainline or Death Dealer. It'll be Gerard with the first creature. That's Sylvan Caryatid.
Yeah, Gerard's got to be thrilled that the board is empty here on the second turn for Brian.
Yeah, still get to see Policeman Line. It's one turn late to the parties. That's Brian's play on turn 3. Same cards as we've seen each game. The Caryatid from Fabiano, the Lion from Brian. However, this time, Brian is just a little bit slower on all of his plays, giving Gerard an extra turn. And we'll see what exactly Brian is working with as a Thoughtseize comes out from Fabiano. You see in Braun-Duin's hand, there's land number 4, one more threat, that's Siege Rhino, and then 3 sets of removal. Bioblight, Hero's Downfall, and Back to Nature.
This is really good news for Gerard because he can take the Siege Rhino out of his hand if he wants to and leave Brian with a purely reactive hand. If Gerard has a removal spell to follow up with on the Fleecemane Lion, then it's Brian with reactive cards lodged in his hand, and that gives Gerard a lot of time to deploy his more powerful cards.
Yeah, Ryan really doesn't want to be the reactive deck in these games. Or maybe he does, actually. It's close. I suppose it can be closer.
I think it's tougher post-board when Gerard has access to Disdainful Stroke because it means that Brian's big trumps are no longer necessarily going to resolve.
And there you have it. Does take Siege Rhino. Gerard has not played a land yet. We'll see what he's up to. He does not want that Fleecemane Line to get a counter on it if he can at all help it. And for Gerard, it's going to be Ashiok Nightmare Weaver. Gets that plus 3s. Gets Landmore Wastes, Stand Step Citadel. No creature just yet.
And if those were Brian's 3 draw steps,
Gerard could have.
I think it's all over.
You can't. You're right, but you can't look at it.
No,
that
I know.
way.
I understand that that's a
But
fallacy,
you're right.
but it is noteworthy.
That'd be the situation where you'd be like, wait. I undo that play. Put those back. Thoughtseize, the draw from Brian Braun-Duin. We'll get to see it Gerard's hand, and it is a ton of removal. Hero's Downfall, Silence the Believers, and Eidolon of Blossoms.
Now you're really getting the framing of the matchup here. The 2 hands that we've seen Thoughtseize are very similar. There's a creature and a bunch of removal spells. But this hand is really bad for Brian to see, and Gerard was probably thrilled with what he saw. And that's just one of these decks is the beatdown and one's the control deck.
When both players are just sitting on giant piles of removal, as long as they're not Hero's Downfall, how good is Ashiok in this situation?
Pretty good, though. I imagine Brian's just going to take care of it here.
Yeah, he did. One of his was a Hero's Downfall. So removal spells from both. Gerard's a little more robust. He does have a card. Well, he did have the Eidolon of Blossoms. I guess he's now just on kill spells. So we'll wait around for a while. Gerard does not want that lion to get monstrous. That would be all sorts of bad here. So he'll cast a kill spell, and now we're going to wait to see who draws some threats.
And he wants to do that right away because he doesn't want to get in a position where Brian plays a 5th land, attacks, and then says go, and then you have that staring match.
Another replacement sleeve here from Gerard. Gerard going for back-to-back wins. Remember with the Grand Prix champion last weekend. Uses Brian's Urborg once again, this time to cast Thoughtseize. It is Bioblight, and Back to Nature. Does Brian have Whip? Is Gerard trying to get his Whip to resolve? Is he trying to get his Hornet Queen to work? That'll affect what he takes.
But even still, this is just shaping up to be a really good game for Gerard, no matter what path he wants to take, because Brian's creatures don't really generate value when they come into play for the most part. So Gerard's removal spells are very potent answers. The same is not true in reverse. Gerard has cards like Eidolon of Blossoms, like Hornet Queen, where even if Brian can answer them, Gerard gets some amount of card advantage along the way.
Brian has draw Murderous Cut. That's not any help, just more removal. Next one, Windswept Heath. Both players just trading draws until one finds a threat. It's just lands and removal spells seem to be the draws on both sides for now.
But it's not just about finding a threat. For Brian, it's finding multiple threats in a row.
Yeah, he has to clog his way through this hand that Gerard has amassed.
Something like Nissa, for example, would be a great draw here. Something that warrants a Hero's Downfall on the Planeswalker and a removal spell on the land.
Yeah, he could also have something like Fleecemane Lion. He's getting very close to 7 mana. At that point, he can play Fleecemane Lion with the 5 mana needed up. Means he would get 2 kill spells out of Gerard if he went for it.
There are some good draws in Brian's deck, but I think Gerard right now is definitely... The top of the deck is going to be friendlier to him on average.
Lands continue to trade for both players. Another Sylvan Caryatid for Gerard. Not a land, but almost could be. And for Brian, it'll be Fleecemane Lion, and this is exactly it. It's the 7 lands and Fleecemane Lion.
And I think now you're going to see a staring contest where Gerard's not going to use a removal spell as long as Brian has 5 up, and Brian's not going to commit to the monstrous power until Gerard's shields are down.
Well, that means that Brian will get to start swinging in for 3 damage a turn if they play it that way. So this is a pretty decent weapon for Brian.
It's not bad. It's either pressure or it eats 2 removal spells.
Well, Gerard will try to find something else to do with it. It'll be Treasure Cruise from him. Delving 5, paying 3. And when you have this staring match, it's a card like Treasure Cruise. It seems like one of the best things you can be doing.
Exactly. Gerard's got some really nice one-ofs when the game gets into this sort of spot. Silence the Believers as well. His deck is just stocked with more power.
Farika, God of Affliction, seems like one of the best things he could be doing, too.
Even Disdainful Stroke is a huge draw. You have a feeling Brian's got to resolve one of his big things to have a shot in this game.
Fleecemane Lion will start to go to work on Gerard's life total. It swings in for 3, making a dent, but it's got a ways to go. Gerard with another land passes back. He's down to 9, was at 14, but he used a Thoughtseize and took that 3 from Fleecemane Lion. So we'll have to find an answer for that guy soon. But with 6 cards in hand, you have to think he has a plan. And it's a good one. Kiora, the Crashing Wave. Targeting Fleecemane Lion. This one's excellent.
That is an excellent spot for Kiora. You know, Brian still can't commit to the monstrosity power here because Gerard can remove in response. Now attacking is shut off.
Now, if Brian hits 10 lands, then maybe he could do something here, but he's 2 off that. And in that time, Kiora, if she gets all the way up to 5, that might be more than Brian can deal with.
Yeah, I mean, that's beating an emblem here is really, really challenging. You're looking at something, again, like a Sorin emblem to help you get out, and Gerard's got 2 Caryatids as a buffer. Even assuming that, you know, Sorin could get all the way to the finish line, which is ambitious.
He's got a lot of Heroes Downfall in his hand, too.
Yep.
Silence the Believers, and I believe multiple Heroes Downfalls in Gerard's hand at the moment. For Brian, it's going to be Rakshasa Death Dealer. And a pass. Remember that Fleecemane Lion does not deal any damage this turn. No point in attacking.
I think Gerard will probably just shift gears here, start using Kiora on the Death Dealer, or he can untap, remove the Death Dealer with a removal spell, then activate Kiora on the Fleecemane Lion, prompt a response from Brian.
Well, he doesn't have to worry about the regenerating on Death Dealer. He does have Silence the Believers in his hand, and that just exiles creatures.
The issue is not about regeneration or not, it's about mana. Because Gerard does not want to get in a position where Brian can monstrous the Fleecemane Lion. That's the big thing that Gerard's trying to avoid right now. So, however Gerard needs to finagle his mana and his removal spells, that's the #1 priority.
He will use Kiora once again on Fleecemane Lion. That'll take care of that. Maybe we silence away the Death Dealer then, get back to the same board state. We'll see how he chooses to go. He's building up toward the emblem, almost certainly here.
Gerard can also say, I'm just going to chump block the Death Dealer twice.
Sure, he has Sylvan Caryatids, but it's not like Brian can remove them as blockers.
So Gerard has multiple paths here, and I think once he gets to an emblem, Brian's going to be extremely hard-pressed to win. Setting aside what we know about Gerard's hand and all the draw steps he's had in the meantime.
Absolutely, and Brian knows it. It's a tough spot he's in. Needs to get that Kiora off the table. He has 2 turns to do it.
I really like what Gerard's done here, games 3 and 4. I don't know how much of his sideboard has changed, how he's approached the matchup here, but his deck just resembles much more of a mid-range deck than a Reanimator deck, and I think that's the right approach for this matchup.
Abzan, mid-range, always somewhat decent against the aggro versions, and the more Gerard can resemble a traditional mid-range deck, the better it will be.
Gerard has a lot of moving parts that plays into Brian's beatdown in a general sense, and the more that Gerard is leaning on Whip of Erebos, the more that plays into Anafenza and Bat to Nature. But this just boatload of removal and Planeswalkers, that's a great path.
Abzan Charm is the play here from Brian Braun-Duin. Believe it's draw 2, lose 2. And it is. Gerard will let that one resolve. In theory, Gerard has negates available to him in his 75, though I can't imagine they've been boarded in.
I think Disdainful Stroke is the counter that he wants, and he can only afford so many counters.
Exactly. Brian plays a land. And as he gets closer to 10 mana, Brian gets closer to a spot where he could use the monstrosity on the Fleecemane Lion, but Kiora just makes a clock out of this.
Well, this is the tough spot now because Brian drew 2 cards as the first order of business. If he pumps the Death Dealer to push through this Caryatid that's blocking, he's suddenly down to 4 mana. And
So
then
he'll lose
Gerard
the
has-
Fleecemane Lion.
Gerard has free reign.
Gerard could actually silence the Believers, both the creatures. It would be a disaster for Brian.
Exactly. So I think that Brian's in a spot now where he just has to pass back to Gerard because the only thing that's preventing the floodgates from opening on from Gerard's side is Brian keeping this 5 mana up.
Yeah, and if I were to guess, it seems like Brian is just trying to dig to a copy of Hero's Downfall. It's his cleanest answer to this situation. Had he hit one off Abzan Charm, he would be able to stabilize this.
Sort of. I mean, there's still other issues
Sure.
going on. Gerard's got a handful of cards. We know a lot of them are removal.
Kiora up to 5, targeting Fleecemane Lion. She is set to make an emblem next turn. Brian needs to deal some damage to her. As the 9/9s she can make will eventually take over the game. The only real answer Brian has is a Sorin emblem, but instead he doesn't even have a Sorin in play. A lot of things keeping him off that.
And an immediate chump block here from Gerard. He's trying to go to the emblem, I believe, next turn.
Death Dealer swings. You're right. Sylvan Caryatid chump blocks. This time Brian will pay the mana to make Death Dealer into a 4/4. It moves the Caryatid to the graveyard. And that brings us back to Fabiano. Unless Brian has another play, he'll scry here. But unless he has a Hero's Downfall, that means Kiora has the option to go make an emblem.
I do not imagine Brian can cobble together a hand that can beat that.
A lot of cards still in Brian's hand. A lot of removal spells, but none of them apparently the Hero's Downfall he needs to take care of Kiora. And you're right, he passes. Gerard's turn. Could not do it quicker. Kiora -5. Now we get an emblem. So the beginning of each of Gerard's upkeeps, he gets a 9/9 blue Kraken token.
And Gerard has shown so much discipline. He hasn't cast anything. The only thing he's concerned about is leaving up the maximum amount of mana to be able to play against the monstrous power and whatever else Brian has going on in his hand. He's not trying to commit any more permanents to the board. He knows this emblem is good enough.
You see there, getting his first 9/9. So it's at each of his end steps, actually, he gets the token. So it'll be able to block first and then attack on the next turn. See, Brian, now the 1-for-1 removal is going to come out, but he needs to make progress, and it has to be quick because these 9/9s are just going to keep happening. There's no way to remove the emblem.
And I'm curious if this is good enough to warrant a disdainful stroke if it's in Gerard's hand, or if he's happy to say, I'm only stopping Siege Rhinos, Wingmate Rocks, whatever the big trumps are, because I don't think that you can kill me with 1-for-1 removal before Kiora's emblem overwhelms you.
He will use Disdainful Stroke on this Murderous Cut, so he agrees, yeah, he wants to win with some quickness here. It actually could take him a while. Rakshasa Death Dealer can regenerate and block 9/9s.
But
So
once
maybe.
Brian's offense gets shut down because he can't attack anymore, it's only a matter of time.
Absolutely. Go to Brian's main phase. He does have Gerard to 9, so there's a chance that he can sneak damage through, but there will be a lot of Krakens, and they're going to swing quickly.
And we also know that Gerard has the option here of starting to use his removal spells on Brian's creatures. He's sitting on a lot of it as a concession to Brian leaving up 5 mana for Fleecemane Lion, but he can go after the Death Dealer, even the Fleecemane Lion, with 2 removal spells whenever he feels like it.
Brian preparing his mana here. We'll see how does he get through? Maybe Wingmate Rock is what he's hoping for. There's the copy of Hero's Downfall. Just a little late to take care of Kiora. Can take care of the first 9/9 though.
Yeah, Wingmate Rock seems like a big deal here for allowing Brian to win this game, but if Gerard was willing to use a Disdainful Stroke on a Murderous Cut, I just suspect it's not there. Or
Brian-
excuse me, I suspect another Disdainful Stroke or some other answer is available for Gerard.
2 creatures swing from Brian. Gerard will put the Caryatid in front of Death Dealer. Brian will pump. As it stands, Gerard will take 3, go to 6. Brian will keep both his creatures. Gerard will lose the Caryatid. It's not over yet. Brian may be able to push this damage through depending on what Gerard's hand looks like.
It seems like Gerard is contemplating now, maybe this is the moment where I want to use some removal spells.
And he will cast Murderous Cut for 1 mana. Now, the important part is, depending on where he's cast this, he has enough mana to cast Silence the Believers and Strive It.
So if Brian elects to regenerate here, that opens up the Silence of Believers to clear out everything. And then it's a Kiora emblem against an empty board.
Yeah. We'll confirm that it's targeting the Death Dealer. I suppose there's a chance. Yeah, there's a chance he could target also the Lion. Death Dealer does more damage. She's going to go for that one. If Brian tries to save either of his creatures here, really,
Yeah.
then he'll lose the whole team.
And I think that Gerard would prefer to save the Caryatid here if he has the choice to do so, because that just represents another chump blocker. And every chump blocker he has means that a removal spell on a token doesn't matter as much.
Well, here we have it. He's paying 2 to regenerate. I believe Brian Braun-Duin knows about Silence the Believers here.
Yes, but, at some point, is he just going to leave up 5 mana the whole game?
Yep. 7 paid by Gerard. That does not destroy anything. You can't regenerate from it. It exiles both creatures, and it's the empty board and the Kiora.
And this is the board state Gerard's worked the whole game to get to, which is this Kiora emblem, an empty board, removal in hand, Brian no longer with Police Main Lion, and Gerard should be able to overtake this game momentarily.
Yep, plays a land, and he's not even going to waste his time. It'll be Hornet Queen and the 9/9 for Gerard.
Just for good measure,
Brian doesn't play sweepers. There's no reason not to continue to commit like this.
In case you think a 9/9 every turn is not going to be good enough.
Yeah, BioBlight takes care of the first set of insects. Brian with some copies of that card. I believe multiples of it. Needs to get in that 9 damage. Remember, Gerard already with 11 power on the board. He's going to win this one pretty quickly if Brian doesn't have blockers.
I think we're just about to go to game number 5. Gerard with an opportunity to come back from down 0-2.
Remember, both these players tapping fetch lands thanks to the Urborg that each of them has now brought to the board. And here's the Wingmate Rock that Brian may have been looking for. A little late to the board, it no longer has a creature to raid it with. And even if there's no kill spell from Gerard, it's not good enough to race. But Gerard, for good measure, does have Hero's Downfall. It's going to be a swing for 11. Brian down to 4. Gerard with a second 9/9 here. And you're right, this is going to go. This is going to go to game 5. Another Hornet Queen from Gerard. He's now just unleashing everything that he was hanging on to the whole game.
Big draw step for Brian, and it's
Dune Blast.
not going to do it.
The Dune Blast,
Dune Blast
he's not
every turn
playing.
for the rest of the game.
Yeah, so there you go. Gerard digging his way out of an 0-2 hole, now up to 2-2. We will go to the deciding game 5 here. Who will go to the finals? Is it Gerard, Fabiano, Brian Braun-Duin? Gerard really has been the dominant player this tournament. While there have been a lot of matches, we had 12 elimination matches up to this point, 1 for each of the players. I'll tell you what, Gerard, he's played in 0 of them to this point.
Yeah, he's just been on a tear. I mean, everyone else has had some pretty harrowing experiences, most notably Reed Duke, who's been in a variety of elimination matches.
Yeah, Reed has had his back to the wall, won many times, but Gerard, it's been a coast through this for him.
More or less. I mean, it's never going to be easy, but he's definitely I would say he's had the least stressful route of anyone who's still left in the tournament.
Absolutely. He has 1 loss to his name up to this point, and that was in Legacy. Lost to Brad Nelson. It was Sneak and Show versus Gerard's Sultai control deck over in Legacy.
Just done a great job, Gerard has, in my opinion, of converting his deck these post-board games. Game 1, of course, his deck is what it is. Game 2, there was still a lot of graveyard matter stuff going on. Games 3 and 4, that really hasn't been a factor here. And now you can look at BBD thinking about things. Maybe back to nature. It's possible Gerard's mostly gotten away from it. I mean, that was a really drawn-out game where you saw very little in the way of enchantments, no Whip of Erebos. I'm not even, to be honest with you, I'm not even confident Courser Crewfix is left in Gerard's deck at this point. I think he might have sideboarded very heavily to mitigate the damage of Back to Nature.
All right, well, these players get ready for the final game. And remember, the winner of this will go into the finals. But before that, we'll have our other semifinal match following the conclusion of this one. This is former Player of the Year Brad Nelson versus Reed Duke, current Platinum Pro, probably favorite for the tournament. A great match between the two of them as to who will take on the winner. Both players playing different builds of Sultai. Will it be Sidisi taking it down, or will it be the Eidolon of Blossom's Constellation strategy?
And potentially sets the stage for 2 friends and testing partners to meet in the finals of this tournament. Gerard and Reed directly worked together for this event. Gerard from northern New Jersey, Reed from upstate New York. Brian and Brad didn't really directly work for this event, but of course, both living in Roanoke, working for Star City Games, people who have worked together for events many times.
Yeah, actually, I mean, to be fair, Gerard and Reed drove to this event together from upstate. Well, Brian and Brad, they both drove about 10 minutes to this event together as well.
Yep. Gerard and Reed going to a concert together once they get back from this event. Very close friends. And, you know, I have worked with Gerard myself in the past. I know that it's, you know, he's got a reputation for being, you know, definitely an unorthodox player, makes some weird deck building decisions. But I have to say, if you know, having someone with a different perspective on a large team is incredibly valuable. And every time I work with Gerard for a new constructed event, he didn't necessarily build the best decks, but he always identified the card from the new set that was going to define the tournament. We worked on an extended Pro Tour. He saw Cabal Therapy, and no one else on Team Target identified it as something significant. When we were working together for the Onslaught Block Constructed Pro Tour that Osip Levadovich won, Gerard identified Explosive Vegetations as the card that was really the secret to that tournament. So he does have a sharp eye. There's no doubt about it.
Can find things that a lot of the other players would miss in a format. And that keen eye, at the very least, as you've seen in Legacy and in Standard, Sultai has been his strategy. Certainly, as you said before, the biggest Ashiok fan of really anyone right now.
And he's in the conversation right now on the short list of best limited players in the game, too. 2 Grand Prix wins, very recent, Montreal and Baltimore. Lost in the finals of Grand Prix Charlotte as well. All of these relatively recent finishes.
As we go to Game 3, Braun-Duin will be on the play for this one. He is down to 6 cards on a mulligan here. And that does seem like it's penalizing in this matchup.
Definitely. When Gerard has converted much more into a mid-range, try to one-for-one you, draw cards, kill you arbitrarily sort of deck, mulligans are a lot more punishing.
Those we've seen. With a good 6, Brian can run Gerard out of the gates. He did it Game 1. He ran it back Game 2. It looked like Brian may run away with this 3-0, but Gerard turning it around, really morphing into a control deck, has been able to even things up.
Really incredible. I thought Brian had a significant edge deck to deck coming into this matchup.
Absolutely.
But I think that Gerard has identified what the issues are and has changed his deck substantially. It just feels like a different deck. What we saw games 1 and 2 versus what we saw in game 3 and 4, it's not the same deck anymore.
I think I agree. Game 1 was a great game for Brian. There's nothing Gerard can do about it. It's his Game 1 deck. Brian has a good aggro curve, wins the game. Game 2, Gerard tries to slow things down, but a very great back to nature on Brian's part sends it in his favor again. So Gerard's in an 0-2 hole. And now we see Gerard more counter spells, more card advantage, cuts enchantments, and that plan seems to have worked so far. Turn 1 Thoughtseize from Brian, and yeah, it's a control deck from Gerard. 4 lands, Satyr Wayfinder, Bioblight, and Murderous Cut is the keep.
And I'm sure Brian's going to take one of the 2 removal spells here because Gerard has no graveyard synergy to speak of except for one of his removal spells and has seemed to de-emphasize it in a general sense anyway.
No matter which kind of early creature Brian has, Gerard will be covered. Thanks to Satyr Wayfinder, that Murderous Cut will be online on turn 3. Bioblight, great against all of Brian's early plays. I think the hole Brian can punch is that if he has Anafenzas and Siege Rhinos, taking Murderous Cut here, as he has, could give him an opportunity.
Exactly. I think that if Brian had something to do on turn 2, there's a very good chance he takes Bioblight there. But if his hand's just more of his bigger mid-range threats, then the Murderous Cut is the standout. He might be able to strand Gerard with a Bioblight that can't kill anything.
Second land, and just a pass from Braun-Duin, and is actually running into the same problem he ran into in Game 3. Right now, all his lands are pain lands once again, so he may deal upwards of 10 damage to himself. For Gerard, Satyr Wayfinder, almost missing, finds 3 spells and a land. He takes a Landmore Wastes, milling Hero's Downfall and Disdainful Stroke, and look at that, has boarded an even negate for the matchup.
Now, I thought that I was suspicious of negate at first, but given what Gerard's done, just sort of normalizing and streamlining the deck, any one-for-one trade's going to be good when back with, you know, his Treasure Cruise, his Read the Bones, his just generally more powerful deck.
Just morphing into a control strategy. The draw from the turn from Braun-Duin was Obzon Charm. Do you see it as game plan is a control one? He has Siege Rhino in his hand, so that hole where all of Gerard's removal is conditional, that's what Brian's looking to capitalize on.
And if he takes this Eidolon of Blossoms and leaves Gerard with just Bioblight, Gerard's at risk of just flooding out or not having enough high-impact cards. And a lone Siege Rhino could be a big problem.
Lands 3 through 6 are in Gerard's hand. But Brian, no third land, and that's huge.
And now we're going to see, it's one of those races. Can Brian find the requisite mana before Gerard finds a card that matters?
Third land from Gerard. Does not have a card that matters yet. Brian down to 13. Draws for the turn. It's a Windswept Heath. Brian has found land 3. Has to weigh his options here. He has a copy of Abzan Charm. Now, he'll get dangerously low on life if he draws 2 with that. He'll have to fetch down to 12, Pain down to 10 to cast Abzan Charm, down to 8 on Resolution, 7 from Satyr Wayfinder. This is becoming pretty significant.
He does get to make it all up if his follow-up is Siege Rhino, but he is taking a ton of damage off of his lands.
Satyr Wayfinder swings and puts Brian down to 12, but it looks like Gerard has found a card that matters. Well, actually hasn't yet, but he's about to. Treasure Cruise is his play.
I would say Treasure Cruise counts.
Well, it could draw 3 lands.
It's true.
It in and of itself is not that haymaker Gerard's looking for, but it's pretty good. Gerard filling back up to 8 cards in hand, now down to 7 on Llanowar Wastes, and he'll Thoughtseize back on Brian. And we'll see, what has BBD been building up toward? He has to decide if he wants to Abzan Charm now, before the Thoughtseize resolves. How important is it that he hits the land?
If he Abzan Charms kind of misses, and then the Siege Rhino gets stripped out of his hand,
Thanks,
then
John.
he's in danger, as you mentioned, of just taking too much damage here.
He's going to go for it, though. Figures if that land's not coming, then it's not winning anyway.
Yep.
So fetches down to 11, and this is what I was talking about, where he's going to take a lot of damage. If he actually Abzan Charms, he'll go down to 7 here.
And that's something that, his mana base is built that way. He can't afford that many lands that come to play tap because he's trying to play a 2-drop, a 3-drop, a 4-drop, Thoughtseize along the way, and so forth. So a consequence is that is just a lot of pain lands.
That's why they play multiple copies of Urborg. Generally, you would never want more than 1 legendary land, but just wants those few opportunities where he actually can have lands come into play untapped and not hurt him. So the Abzan Charm draws 2, loses 2. Brian down to 7, and now Thoughtseize will resolve. We see land, looks like it did happen. Caves of Koilos and Llanowar Wastes were the draws, so 2 more pain lands, but this is exactly one of the things you worried about.
This was the nightmare scenario for BBD. He doesn't find a second card of substance. He loses his Siege Rhino. Now his hand's purely reactive, and Gerard has just resolved a Treasure Cruise.
Well, he did draw something that's relevant here. It was a Sorin Solemn Visitor. Now, Gerard may have drawn a Hero's Downfall, but Brian has a play right now.
This is something. This is probably not as good as drawing a Siege Rhino would have been, but this is, at least it's a starting point.
Brian down to 6 to make the Sorin, but now he has a 2/2 Vampire on the table. 2 Murderous Cuts in hand. He'll be able to take care of Gerard's threats. The wet question is, can Gerard take care of Brian's cards? If so, Gerard looks to be in a good spot.
He's got a full grip against someone just sitting on a couple removal spells.
Yeah, but if Gerard's way of stabilizing instead of his own kill spells are his own threats, Brian's hand's looking good against that.
Well, he's still down a lot in terms of just cards and general resources and life total. So he can at least stay alive. It gives him an opportunity to top deck, but he is behind.
Bioblight takes care of the Vampire token. Gerard will swing the Satyr Wayfinder into the Sorin. It drops Sorin down to 1. Brian won't be able to make another Vampire next turn. Another Satyr Wayfinder from Fabiano. Temple of Malady is the land flipped up. Put some enchantment creatures into the graveyard here. Stocks up again for more Delve spells. It will be a Temple for the turn, and that'll be it for Gerard. But now that the Sorin's down to 1, these Satyr Wayfinders may actually be able to take care of it. Brian will have to spend Murderous Cuts on Satyr Wayfinders.
Yeah, I mean, he's in a spot now where he gets to make a choice between 2 bad spots. Use his removal spells to keep Sorin alive by killing Wayfinders or allowing his Sorin to die.
Sorin's at 2. Gerard's going to try to take it down. Is Brian going to Murderous Cut a Wayfinder? It's that or lose his Sorin. And he will pay 4, exile 1, take 1, go to 5, get rid of the Satyr. Sorin goes to 1. Not the trade he wanted to be making, but the trade he has to make.
Yeah, splitting the difference a little bit because the Sorin can keep the Wayfinder occupied and allows him to keep a Murderous Cut in his hand.
Yeah, wants to spend as few of those cuts on satyrs as possible. Gerard with a follow-up, though. For tapping 4, it's Eidolon Blossoms. He'll draw a card. Full grip here for Gerard. Really leveraging the advantage he's built for himself. Plays Temple of Deceit, and the scry is to the top.
And it looks like Gerard may have come all the way back. We're still some turns away, but you got to like where he's at.
Brian's so close to being dead here. Just down to 5. Plays a forest for the turn. Looks like he will go down to 4. Siege Rhino. He could have done a lot worse than that.
But, you know, Gerard's been sitting on a handful of cards for a while.
Gerard, handful of cards, and Gerard just scried to the top with the Temple. Brian, up to 7. Gerard down to 12. Gerard needs to have a removal spell for Siege Rhino. Does he have it? If he does, he'll get both of Brian's cards, both the Rhino and the Sorin. He'll run Brian out of resources. 6 cards are in Gerard's hand. Among them, it looks like Hornet Queen is one of them. A lot of great lines for Fabiano here. We'll see what he wants to do. Silence the Believers. Looks like it's been shuffled to the front.
Yeah, it's definitely not. Gerard's not thinking because of an absence of removal. He's determining what removal spell he wants to use.
If it's removal at all. And it looks like it will be. Taking 1 point of damage to make Silence the Believers on Siege Rhino. It will get exiled. Brian, I think, pointing out that Gerard takes a point. He's down to 11.
Yep.
And here's the swing, Eidolon Blossoms and Satyr Wayfinder. We'll see where they go. Gerard knows about the second Murderous Cut.
Yeah, this is the most obvious attack, is send the lethal attacker at the Sorin. I think there's actually an argument for doing it in reverse. So you either kill the attacker that's going at BBD, the bigger creature, or, you know, it just makes it harder to use the removal spell. He lets Brian off the hook a little bit there by just making it easy.
Well, what I like actually here is he sent both of them at Sorin. So even when Brian kills the 2/2, the Sorin goes down to 1.
Okay, I thought he might have been splitting up his attackers there.
And now that Brian spent all his time protecting Sorin, it'll be Hero's Downfall from Gerard. Brian, no cards, no in play, no cards in hand. Can Gerard have the follow-up? And Satyr Wayfinder swings and puts Brian down to 4. And what a follow-up it is. It is Hornet Queen from Gerard.
You can see the look on Brian's face. He knows he is done for.
And here's the draw, and it looks like the comeback has been completed, down 2-0. Gerard, Fabiano, and Sultai Reanimator. Looks like they'll be moving on to the finals. Last draw here from Brian. It's Sorin. He'll make a vampire.
That's only one blocker.
It's only one blocker. A full swing should do it, and Gerard Fabiano knows that. Kill spell just to make sure. And here comes the team, and there you have it. Gerard Fabiano moves on to the finals.
All the way back, you can see the relief on Gerard's face, the disappointment all over BBD's. Up 2-0, looked like a good matchup. Give a lot of credit to Gerard. He clearly changed the strategy in the post-board games. Didn't rely nearly as much on his graveyard. I don't think he activated Whip of Erebos once in 5 games. And that's one of the defining features of this deck. But I think Gerard knew that play pattern, that path, was a long shot and got away from it, converted into a mid-range deck. Lots of removal, lots of card drawing, lots